Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. First, thank you to our amazing panelists. What fun and such a great kind of conversation to get us really thinking about all of these things we've been talking about over the past, couple days of the Hollywood Climate Summit. We've heard the talks, we've heard those kind of organizations and companies speak, but what does this actually look like in action? How do we actually implement this? And I'm here today to kind of do a little bit of a Q&A to really kind of flesh that out with you. How do we use some of those Indigenous methodologies? How do we put some of this into practice? What does it look like? To introduce myself, Oki Nistunutaniku Maya Dittloff. I am a Blackfeet writer, director, filmmaker. I'm currently living on occupied Tongva lands, but was born up on the northern Montana border with Canada, Glacier National Park on the Blackfeet Nation. So hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Now I've got a few minute spiel here. I'm just going to kind of run through, but I definitely want to say first and foremost that there are no wrong questions. Anything that you want to ask, anything you want to say, even if you're not sure how to say it, throw that in the chat. If it happens to be wrong, I will just gently correct it. But really, I just want to say, hello and welcome. This is a shared space, and I'm happy to be here with you all. So first off, kind of want to ask ourselves, why is this knowledge valuable? How do we use this? As a filmmaker, a writer, someone who's got a TV show currently in production, what do we do about this? I am very grateful to kind of Ali and Jade for kind of, and Mark for really centering that, hope in the conversation, kind of this idea that like we can imagine a radical future in which there is climate justice, in which there is racial justice, because these things are intertwined. And I think it goes without saying to know that, it was said again that, Indigenous people hold a lot of that biodiversity. But at the same time, we've got a lot of those answers. They just need to be, asking the right questions. And for me, that comes down towards a lot of stewardship of the land, but also knowing that in America, we've got history that's, unavoidably racist. And I think that extends also to Hollywood. I know in Los Angeles, people really like to think that they're, an arm's length away from that racism, from that history, but it's just not true at all. As kind of a brief overview on that history, by the time, settlers were getting to the state of California, they had changed their methodologies from how they kind of interacted with Native nations. And we've seen kind of that growth westward. Oklahoma became Indian territories, but by the time they got to California, it was literally kill on sight. With that being, the methodology of kind of the land that Hollywood is quite literally built on, what do we do in terms of reparations? How can we fix, these things that have gone on? And part of that, again, is intertwined with climate justice, but really also in this paradigm shift. And I think that's what I'm asking most today is how do we shift that paradigm? So for example, the Sony lot, you can think here who's all been to the Sony lot, used to be owned by Thomas Ince. And as a part of kind of that early history of Hollywood, he quite literally had a band of Native Americans living on the lot that he would call into set to use on those Westerns. And they called those the Inceville Indians. It's really kind of work in kind of what does it mean to kind of, exoticize these communities and include them in ways that behooved kind of the white methodologies that we're building in our very nascent film industry. But how can we fix this? What do we do? Where do we go? Of course, we know that film is an expression of identity. It's tethered to different concepts then for Indigenous people as opposed to white folks. And I think as a part of that, and I think the way that I really kind of consider this as a filmmaker, as a writer, is multiple ways. First, like we said in the panel before, centering the land. I am huge on kind of that land as character, being able to flesh out the scripts and what does this feel like? What do the edges of this world say? And that's applicable from everything to, those Western biopics towards even just imagining new futures. We're in the pivotal time of kind of being able to center hope in our content that we want to make. It's something execs are actively looking for. And, you know, here in the audience, you know, we've all heard it. What is that next big show? What is that next thing that we're looking towards creating? What do audiences want right now? And as a part of that, knowing that we've all survived this global pandemic and are continuing to fight against it, where do we seek for this kind of, you know, resilience against mass grief? Of course, was mentioned before in the panel, Indigenous folks have survived their own apocalypse, and we've got a lot of those answers. But now it's time to reclaim those narratives and those futures and imagine a world in which we can truly coexist. Another one of kind of those units that I think sets apart some of that kind of Indigenous storytelling and that reframing of the paradigm is also just purely the consideration of time. So in being Blackfeet, I know that I specifically come from a culture which does not have days of the week. We do not have 7 days of the week. We do now under a colonial paradigm. But historically, that was, you are always living in the present. The day of the week is always today, and there is tomorrow, the next day, but also yesterday and the day after that. So when you reframe that time away from kind of, you know, what we have all been taught in elementary school, what we all know from our public education, how do you begin to re-see the world, the way time works, the way we interact with other creatures around us? And I think that's something that I'm, you know, very grateful, having kind of grown up very much immersed in nature and growing up in northern Montana, that I see as a difference in some of the peers around me in terms of kind of Hollywood and storytelling, because it allows different entry points. And I think right now we've got a lot of talk on kind of, you know, what does it mean to actually do diversity and inclusion? What does it actually mean to kind of fold these communities into the loop? How does that look like when you are one of these large scale companies, when you're a development company, when you're trying to get something into production? And I think, of course, it's kind of, you know, like I said, folding in those communities, but also centering hope in all things you do. I think that what was so great about the panel before, and what I think we can have a real time to do now, is it's a return to our first start. We're looking for balance. We're looking for regeneration. And this is a reframing of all things. But moreover, all-encompassing term for that is we're looking to indigenize the process. And I think that's something, you know, I definitely want to hear kind of your questions. What does that look like? I'm happy to answer anything in terms of craft also. But I know that, you know, this is a shift that if you're a non-native person, or if, you know, you've never been exposed to some of these terms and this is the first time you're hearing about it, that there's, you know, a lot of kind of different implications and considerations that go into, you know, what it means to do something the right way. I know kind of first question kind of filtering in here. Feel free to pop more in. What is the proper / respectful way to seek or include land acknowledgements in our films to recognize where we are filming? Very interesting question. Definitely at the top of a lot of people's minds is land acknowledgements. So as a Native person myself, I think it'll often be a first stop in people trying to recognize their own history, lineage, or status as a settler, and those ancestors' history of immigration. What I think land acknowledgements do most effectively is in situations of kind of both education, but coming from a white perspective. You know, to me, I think it is important to recognize that future, that present, that past, and a land acknowledgement is an important way for, you know, a white person, for a settler to be doing that, and to be acknowledging that. And I think it's a great first step. And everyone is different on this, but I think that my personal opinion is that that is the act and the work that you should be doing if you are a settler in this country. And I personally would say that it doesn't necessarily need to be done by an Indigenous person, because that is already their land. They live and breathe and are that acknowledgement of that past. They don't have to say it explicitly. So I think that's a good question for sure. I think that's definitely at the top of mind for a lot of folks. And I think it's a great first step to be considering your own relationship to the land. Now, I think another question filtering in, which is super interesting, what is a good approach to introduce the indigenous language in the story respectfully and also identify the character? What I would caution against is the idea of the pan-Indian in storytelling. From Hollywood, we've gotten a lot of mishmash attributed to costume design and directors of the past and what Westerns once were in terms of just making a conglomerate of what all natives are. So you're getting like people with like, Apache headbands or headdresses in totally the wrong biome. What your job is as a writer, as a creator, is to make this as specific as possible to place and to people. Every nation has their own, traditional regalia. Every nation has their own methods of operating. Is that tribal councils? Is that, these different kind of paradigms that you also have to take in consideration, which are as simple as just Googling where you are at, who those ancestral lands are, and then they'll have a website. Like you can go onto the Blackfeet Nation's website and you can deduce kind of how we organize our systems. In terms of language, also incredibly important. Virtually all native languages are kind of at threat of becoming extinct. I absolutely love and revel in kind of getting to use those kind of, indigenous languages in the content that I write. I think what you're going to want to do is similar to identifying any character. It's, in my case, if I were writing the screenplay of Maya Rose Dittloff, it'd be Maya Rose Dittloff, parentheses, that age, and then those nations. And then you can go on to explain, those different emotional traits of those characters. And then, really kind of digging deep into that, both formatting, but also kind of the paradigm shift in which you frame language. So if you already have a second language, being able to put that on the page is going to be a bit easier, but nevertheless is doable. And there's so much content out there that you can dig into in terms of figuring out, these efforts, which we now consider to be language revitalization. There's so much out there that is so helpful. Next question. What is a good approach to introduce? Oh, no, I just did that one. So next question. How do aspiring screenwriters who want to create a fully inclusive world with diverse characters, BIPOC, LGBTQ, disabilities, etc., best do that without co-opting or appropriating cultures? Very important question to be considering. I think that as a writer, and as with the other Native writers that I know, you get a lot of talk about people asking a Native writer to come on to legitimize the project. And of course, we're right now beginning to figure out, again, what that diversity and inclusion looks like. After the conversations of 2020, and very much kind of eyes are opening to learning towards that lived experience should be considered as a credit in and of itself. That is a different way to view the world. Those will be different endpoints into the stories. When thinking about kind of co-opting or appropriating cultures, I think it's a very important conversation and one that'll definitely be ongoing. But I think the best way to be doing that is kind of doing that deep dive again into character, into place, into rooting that person in community. And I think whatever that means, even if that's a disconnect with community, what does that have effect on the page? In terms of co-opting or, appropriating, there's definitely going to have to just be talks. It's going back and forth. That's dependent upon the project, upon what they're doing, upon genre, addressing that when it's, building new worlds. If that's sci-fi, that's going to be a different consideration altogether. Than if that's like, again, like a Western, or if that's history. So I think being able to dive in and say kind of authentically, like, who is this person? And acknowledging the kind of limits of your own knowledge, and if and when possible, kind of paying for that knowledge from, people from that lived experience is definitely very important. and think, kind of going on to the next question, how can we look into creating conscious circles of Indigenous and Black solidarity across the world, US, Canada, South America? How do we do that? There are so many shades of indigeneity. Very true. I think, of course, America has its own specific kind of colonial past. And in our country, the United States was built off, the seizure of the lands, and then the slavery and forced, like making Black folks literally kind of till the land. Like, I think it's quite literally our nation was built off of, Indigenous and Black people's labor and exploitation. How do you build global solidarity is kind of such a huge question, but one that is so valuable to be asking in terms of these communities, because we have all at the same time faced a lot of that same struggle. I mean, we're all coming up against, capitalism, and there was a lot of discussion in the last kind of panel about what does that mean. We're all asking for and deserve reparations, and what does that mean? And kind of how are we holding those in power accountable? Well, that means imagining a radical future in which we work together, in which those coalitions exist, in which there is a back and forth on those definitions. In terms of specifically the film industry, there are other countries that have public media funding, such as Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and their film industries are not without fault or problem, but there are funds that exist for Indigenous filmmakers, for Black filmmakers to kind of make a short, to get their voice out there. That does not exist in the United States. I shot a short this summer. It cost me, tens of thousands of dollars. That is something I could do because I am extremely privileged and happy to kind of have an established career. But what about the people that are looking to come up in the industry? Of course, we all know there are so many barriers to entry. I think being able to form a method with which to kind of pull the next generation up is so important. And we're starting to figure out what that is today. And I think it's so important for communities to be in conversation, but to be opening those spaces and creating community, so that we're all lifting each other up at the same time. And I think a good term to have in mind in all of this is just, we are the global majority. And I think being able to kind of take back that power and imagine a future in which, we are able to coexist also with nature, in which we are able to kind of define the parameters of success in storytelling as applicable to our own cultures, is something that is only exciting. I think that's a world in which I want to see kind of what do those stories look like? Like, if I handed a camera to, my younger sister, what story would she want to take? And what if I had the ability to hand a camera to, my great-great-grandma, what story would she have told? I think that ability to imagine that future, present, and past is something that is so interesting and so fun. And I think that right now we are in a moment in which we're starting to open our eyes to that as a new means of storytelling, a new way to tell stories and get those seen and get those heard, and to understand our relationship to each other, to the screen, to the land. Getting to see that in action is so exciting. And I think something that I definitely am hopeful for in terms of the future, and just in terms of kind of how, again, do we indigenize what we see on screen? And there are so many people that are asking those big questions. And how does that actually go into, being able to tell, those kind of, again, stories of the future? I think right now, of course, kind of coming off the back of, Afrofuturism, Indigenous futurism, and together being able to kind of figure out what those, stories are saying, I think is so valuable. And I think there's a world in which, when we imagine going to space, we imagine first and foremost colonizing Mars. And of course, we've all got that on the top of mind because of certain people doing certain things. But nevertheless, does it have to be that way? Is this more, like Star Wars, or is this more Star Trek? I think we're trying to figure out, are we exploring new frontiers, or are we literally colonizing Mars? I think these are important conversations to be having in this day and place, because there's so much anxiety at the same time. And I hope that a lot of what we're, trying to get towards is kind of a relief of that climate anxiety and a kind of truly emboldening and, want and desire to see a future that is better. In some tribes and some nations across the United States, they have what's called the 7 generations. And I think Jade mentioned it in the panel just behind us. But that's the idea, truly, that the actions that I take today, that the way that I live my life now is going to affect, my future descendants. It'll affect those people 7 generations down. So it's living your life today for those 7 generations, for that person you have yet to meet. And I think that that's a paradigm shift that is so helpful when you're beginning to think about how do we actually do this? Because there's a lot of logistics involved in film and television, but being able to kind of upfront, I know yesterday when speaking with some of the producers in the panel, like, where is that power coming from? Is that coming from the director? Are they saying, I need this to be a green production? Is that coming from the producer saying, I need this to be a green production? How are we, yes, ensuring that production is as green as possible? How are we telling new types of stories on the page? How are we getting those into development? How are we listening to new voices? How are we uplifting new voices? How are we providing pathways to the future? Are all considerations that are so important in terms of, building an industry that, like, we all want to see. And I think that's even so evidenced as watching the Emmys from this past week. I think, of course, conversation and having coming off the back of even then the Oscars so black, so white, is how do we kind of tie in Black voices? How do we uplift people of color? How do we get new people on stage, on screen? How do we get them accolades? And right now is those growing pains in which we need to demand more from the people in power, in which we need to really kind of, be saying, we're here, we matter, and our stories deserve to be told, because for so long, they just truly weren't considered of importance. And were truly meant to be squashed. For my community, we all know the adage, kill the Indian, save the man, via boarding schools. And the idea there that once you are able to strip somebody of their culture, of their past, that makes it right. It makes them acceptable. It makes them, able to be one with society. But I think my work, and in all things I consider, is kind of how do we dismantle that? And I think very exciting right now to live in a time in which people, again, are kind of considering that lived experience as something that is valuable, that gives us a different industry, that can be allowing, new worlds to be explored. And that's something that we're all looking for in this time, in this space, is some sort of escape in the content that we watch. And that's, that's what everybody's looking for. It's like, how are we getting out? And you can see that even in, what is popular, what won big at the Emmys. And that's going to be a new conversation when you're thinking about, content that isn't just for, my community, deep, dark, depressing. I know I have a trouble watching any sort of content that's got Native Americans in it. And I think that was because for so long, those voices telling those stories were not Native. And from the outside in, they were latching on to those statistics. For example, like, we know that, like, the majority of Native women are, like, assaulted in their lifetime, and they would see that, oh my gosh, how awful, how sad, and then they would put that in their script, they would put that in their story to be like, look how bad this thing is, when in fact that's just like re-traumatizing these groups of people. So I think that there's ways, for example, and like that's how you do not kind of co-opt culture or kind of lived experience, but create new worlds in which, that's not to say that characters can't go through strife in which they cannot overcome obstacles, but still figuring out kind of, what those relationships are to one another, and how you can be, building stories and building worlds of which, are fully inclusive of the world that we want to see, in the world that truly does exist in this day and age. I think the most important thing that can be done in terms of wanting to know more is that kind of, education, that uplift, there's got to be some of that capital back and flow when we talk about this conversation as a whole and from a macro perspective. There's a ton of good information in the Hollywood Climate Summit Action Guide. I would definitely encourage you all to kind of go in, look at that, dive in, because the conversation today is really kind of that first, toe in the water. I oftentimes kind of meet folks in which they are, it's the first time they've literally ever met someone that is Native American. And the first thing that come out of their mouth is like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. And I'm like, wow, that's fascinating. Like, how can we change that from, oh, wow, that's so cool, to getting, our stories to work for us. And that's my goal as a writer and director, to really kind of get my stories to do the work for me. So people that understand through empathy, and that's really what storytelling is at the end of the day. That's what filmmaking is. Another question: what resources should creatives and aspiring writers keep on their radar for staying involved in Indigenous issues and Indigenous storytelling? I think there is so much great content that is put out online. I think what you're going to have to do is kind of really curate your circle and what content
how are you both doing?
You're paying attention to.
Yeah, I'm doing.
1 second. So I think what that means is evaluate the people that are around you, and that includes your online spaces. I think for me, that's Twitter. For me, that's making sure I'm following Native writers. That's making sure that, I'm following organizations such as Indian Collective that are doing the work in these spaces. And I think it's important that that be all types of people, despite, across class. Are you following Black natives? Are you following, disabled natives? Are you following people that also kind of come from their own communities, and figuring out, like, from their mouth, what is that like? So I think that's kind of one of the biggest things I would say, is just learning by absorbing. And I'm very grateful, having been taught alongside, elders that work in language revitalization, is that that's how we acquire language, is just by being there. And, you've seen babies like sit in a room and like begin to form words. It's the same exact thing. We're always just like absorbing, being what we see, and the people that we are around. So I definitely just say, truly, like, evaluate who am I hearing, who am I seeing, how can I add more voices into the mix of what I see on a daily basis. And that way you'll just learn over time. And I think that's the best way to do it, because there's no crash course. There is no easy fix. But I think that what we ask as a marginalized community is for people to show up and do the work and to be educated. Do we have any last question? I think kind of in terms of what, like, exact resources, that's difficult. I think, like, go and follow, like, the Sundance Indigenous program, go and follow Nia Taro. I think resources, again, I would definitely recommend that you go, you download, you keep on deck the Hollywood Climate Summit's Action Guide. I wrote a lot of that copy for kind of specific Indigenous issues that goes into there. I think that that's going to be kind of your first and foremost. They also, Think Tank for Equality and Inclusion, had kind of little cheat sheets, and they've got those for other communities as well. But I think it's all just the want to seek it out. And a lot of that work can be done via Googling, and then just, again, it comes up over time. So I think that's what's important, is making sure that it isn't just one half-hour session in which you sit down in front of a computer, but that you're building ways for that information to reach your eyes again and again and again. So that's why my suggestion, first and foremost, is social media. Anything else? Favorite show? That's hard. I think right now I would fully recommend everyone go watch Reservation Dogs on FX. I think there are so many important conversations coming out of the show, but I think it's the first time we've been able to figure out on a large scale, what does it mean to kind of get, Indigenous talent in terms of a showrunner, in terms of a staff, in terms of a cast. in terms of shooting, on tribal lands, on those ancestral lands. I think that's definitely such like a fun example of what storytelling can be. And I'm excited to see that future as they learn and they grow. But we've got so much to be figuring out that I think it's super exciting. I think that's the time right now to be, really kind of hearing new voices, to be seeing new worlds is such an exciting and enthralling next couple of years we've got ahead of us. I could name any number of people I know with shows in development that I desperately want to see. So I think it really just means, lifting people up and, demanding that we have change, that we imagine futures, and that we get, a future that we all want to see, which includes, again, that racial justice, that climate justice, and that this is all part of creating a future that we want to see, that centers the land, that creates the future. But yeah, thank you guys all much for the questions. Always happy to kind of be able to speak about, where I come from, what I do. And it has been a pleasure answering all of your questions. Yeah, I mean, if you ever want to reach out, I've got a website, happy to kind of keep this conversation ongoing. As I said, we're still very much at the beginning of figuring out what is Indigenous storytelling in America. We have been really kind of not allowed a voice for so long. And now in reclaiming that, trying to figure out what actually that looks like. And again, it's such a fun, exciting time to be alive and to be a movie watcher, to be a person that watches TV. It'll be a great next couple of years, and hopefully rest of the future. We'll see.